Hi, my name's Phil Szomszor, and I'm joined today by VP of Marketing for EMEA at Rimini Street and a former Chief Communications Officer, Tabita Andersson. Hi, Tabita, how are you doing?
Hey, Phil. Thank you very much for having me. Doing great, thank you.
Oh, it's so good to have you on. So, we're here today to talk about the craft of communications, and that's through finding your voice and using it with impact. But before we get started fully, can you perhaps just begin by talking to us a little bit about your role and your career journey in communications and marketing so far?
Yes, absolutely. So I've had a 25 plus years career in communications, brand, and marketing in a variety of roles. Most recently, I'm now looking after marketing for EMEA for Rimini Street. Prior to that, I was Senior Vice President of Communications and Brand for a data software and analytics company called Clarivate, where I was looking after communications across the entire globe for quite a large organization. And it was when I was at Clarivate that I started working on the book called Chief Communications Officers at Work.
You beat me to it. I was just about to talk about the book, and yeah, give you a plug for that. And we'll be talking about the book in quite a lot of detail shortly. So the full title of the book, because it's one of those that's got. I had another author, Sangeeta Waldron, on earlier in the week, and she's written some books as well, and they've all got long titles. So to give it the full title, it's Chief Communications Officers at Work, Trusted Advisors that Build Influence and Protect Organizational Reputations. So it's a very comprehensive title, shall we say, and a lot in there that we'll discuss in shortly. But can you perhaps begin by just telling us what made you decide to write a book? Because it's quite a big undertaking, isn't it? It's not the sort of thing you dash off in a weekend. So what gave you the impetus to do it in the first place?
Yeah, so the idea really came from a rainy Sunday afternoon when I was sitting looking for something to read. I had read the Chief Marketing Officers at Work book and I found it extremely useful, interesting, and insightful. So I went looking for a similar book around the Chief Comms Officer role, as I was in a comms role and have done a lot of comms in my career. And I couldn't find anything. So I realized there was a little bit of a gap in the market. So I put an idea into the publisher, and 2 weeks later, they came back and said, "Yeah, absolutely, let's do this." So I was then on the hook for actually getting it written and doing all the interviews. And it was a fantastic project, I have to say. It was so exciting to work on. I loved finding all the CCOs. I wanted to have a really wide breadth of voices in the book. So different types of organizations, different countries, different challenges, and just making sure that we had a wide breadth of voices as possible. So I then kind of moved on with the publisher on working on the different interviews. And then obviously we had to put it all together again. And I had a really short deadline. They gave me a 6 months deadline, which I think was probably a good thing. There's
Okay.
nothing like a good deadline to keep you focused. And also it's very apt because it's a very hot topic. How do you lead communications in today's very volatile world with fake news, misinformation? We have macroeconomic conditions and differences that and changes that we've never seen before. So it was very hot topic for them.
Mm.
Um, so we obviously wanted to kind of go through and get the book in market as soon as we could.
And what are some of so you've spoken to 23 chief comms officers, so there'll be a great deal of breadth there. What are some of the commonalities, the common themes that were coming across amongst all those interviews, particularly around all the challenges that they're dealing with at the moment?
Yeah, a couple of things that came through. One is the value of communications. And everyone was working slightly differently in terms of proving the value, but everyone very much agrees there is such a big value to it. And when you do work with the CEO or executives that understand and respect that value, it's a terrific role in trying to really protect your brand. So there's the crisis element of it,
Mm.
and crisis comms is something that I spoke to pretty much everyone, I think, around the different interviews, because it's a big part of what we do in comms is managing crisis comms, and then kind of rolling out and figuring out from the beginning to the end. And there's a few anecdotal stories as well around crisis comms that came out in the various conversations. And then something else that I personally was very keen on making sure that we included is the career stories and career paths of each of the CCOs.
Mm.
So I thought it was really interesting to find out where they all came from and how they all got to the role that they had and what their advice was for more junior comms leaders and more junior comms professionals of what they can do to actually improve their career paths and how to move up the ladder as it were. So those were a couple of things that came through all of the conversations.
I find that last bit quite interesting. I think maybe we'll come back to that, because I think I'd like to sort of dig into a little bit about from an advice point of view, which for people that are watching or listening to this, hopefully there'll be some good tips in there. But going back to the challenges that those comms officers are facing and how they're dealing with it, I think one of the interesting things that you've just said there that made my ears prick up is around the value of comms. And it seems to me that perhaps there's going to be a discrepancy for a start, and it's one of those things that maybe people understand it when there's a crisis, but when there's not a crisis and it's just everyday work, how are some of those leaders actually demonstrating and getting people to understand the value of their work?
I think it came through in a few different ways, because it tends to be a little bit different depending on your organization and how you're situated and who you work together with. For some of the leaders, it was very connected to brand and driving equity in the brand and protecting the brand. For other leaders, it might be more the making sure that it aligns with your business goals and actually driving business performance. And for others, the value is in the trusted advisor part of the role, which is very much around managing stakeholders and influencing and working with your C-suite of leaders to protect your reputation, and working on being the advisor for how you can do that and being in the room when decisions are made. So I don't think there's one clear-cut answer to value. Value depends on what organization you have, what priorities you have, what's the objectives of the role, objectives of the organization. And we can prove it in different ways, which is something that came through during the different conversations.
And thinking about how the roles have evolved over recent years, I mean, obviously we've seen, well, geopolitically, I mean, we must be living in the most, I mean, people say we're living in unprecedented times, but truly we are at the moment. It is very strange out there in the news cycle and in geopolitics and the way that people are talking to each other. So you've got all of that going on. You've got some massive changes in technology. You've got AI. You've got just economic challenges. I don't know about you, I just feel that there's a general tension in the world right now that you just like, it feels like everybody's shoulders are bunched up constantly. How is that affecting the role of a chief communications officer, and what are some of the other things maybe that I've missed off that are also playing into this?
So I think it actually has a positive effect on the role of a chief comms officer in a way, because we are very trained to look at different types of situations. We're very trained in crisis situations. So part of our role is very much looking at the risks, looking at the consequences of different decisions. And we are also very trained and skilled in living in the grey, what I call living in the grey zone. A lot of what we do, actually, most of what we do isn't black and white. It isn't necessarily making a decision one way or another. It's about advising of what would happen if you make this decision versus another decision. So I think we probably have a bit of an advantage when it comes to all the changes that's happening and helping our organizations navigating those changes and navigating what to do with and what to say and how to say it. And I think COVID is a really good example. Obviously, none of us had been through anything like a pandemic before. And it really threw communications, and particularly internal communications, to the forefront, because all of a sudden you had all the eyes of an organization on you, everyone asking, well, what are we doing? What's going to happen? How do we do this? And we really had to step forward and take that proactive approach, which I think was really good for communications as a profession, and also for us as individuals. And we need to take those learnings with us as we continue to grow, I think, both professionally and individually. So I think we have a good opportunity to lead when it comes to change. partly because that's where we're trained, but also because that's where we're gaining experience. And I think on top of all the changes you mentioned, Phil, there's also the organizational changes. I think what I've seen in particular is that the pace of organizational change is just so much more rapid now than going back 10, 15 years ago. There's M&As, there's transformational projects. Yes, some of it is driven by AI, but actually some of it is driven by economical factor, or things are just changing in terms of organizations that have to be more agile, more flexible. So the pace at where everything is going, I think, is really impacting how we can help and guide organizations as well.
And what about things like misinformation and fake news? Because this is something that's come up on a few of the recent episodes that I've done as well, around the challenge from whether you're talking about personal brand or whether you're talking about marketing or demand generation. It seems to be something people are wrestling with. I mean, in comms, it really must be a problem, surely.
It is. I think we have a great role to play in comms to provide the validation and proof points and reference points. So we have a responsibility and an ownership to both think critically about what we see. And I think critical thinking is a massive skill that anyone sort of aiming to be a senior comms professional really need to learn and learn well, because we have a responsibility when it comes to thinking critically about what we see and then providing the validation points and the reference points, both as an organization and as individuals. So yes, I think there's a lot, obviously, of misinformation out there, and that's where we have the ownership of actually stepping up and siphoning out the what's the truth and what's the best way of moving, and just thinking critically about everything that we're seeing, and providing that kind of reflection back from a comms perspective.
Did you get any sense of the techniques or the tools that people are using to combat this? I mean, some of the things I see is where teams get given AI tools and here's a Copilot license, here's a ChatGPT, and then they're resourcing and using. They're getting data that isn't necessarily accurate, and then that creates problems. Like what can be really done on a practical level to stop some of these things getting out or being misused?
No, I totally agree. We have to be careful with the AI tool. They provide so much hallucination that we have to make sure that we think critically about it. I think I'd like to just kind of circle back on the critical thinking, because I think this is one of the key skills that not just comms professionals, but I think everyone really need to hone in on. It is about finding the reference points. It's about looking at the source data. It's about looking at the validation and what's behind the statements and the information, and bringing to the front those really trusted sources.
Mm-hmm.
So I think another I guess point and skill is building that trust. So building that trust on an organization level, as well as from a leadership and thought leadership perspective, is becoming much more important as we probably will see the volume of everything just increasing. So I do believe it's much more about the skills and building that knowledge rather than necessarily the tools. We can't necessarily rely on the tools. So therefore, we have to build the skills to detect them and validate.
No, that makes sense. And I think kind of related to that, I suppose, is this dynamic that you've got with media relations. And obviously that is just part of comms. I'm not saying that is comms in its entirety, but they are also facing same challenges on the different side of the coin, aren't they? And they are under pressure for speed and to get things out, but also for them to be validated. And I suppose there's a role to be played for being a good partner to those organizations. If you're trusted as an organization and as a comms leader, then that can presumably help them in quite a difficult environment for them to flourish in anyway.
Absolutely. And I think that's a massive opportunity for media relations teams and PR teams to step up and help media validate and provide trusted sources to inform the stories and inform the articles. I just think that's a massive opportunity for us more than anything.
And before we get onto the career stuff, which I want to talk about, what were some of the surprises in the book? Was there anything there that you went, I wasn't expecting to hear that?
Yeah, one of the surprises was that there's no difference between B2B and B2C communications. I had a bit of a hypothesis going into the writing, and I wanted to interview and talk to people from both sides because I was wondering what the differences were. Because that's something I'd heard throughout my career is that there's so much difference doing B2C
Mm,
versus B2B. And actually, one of the surprises was there is no difference as such.
okay.
The tools, the craft, what we do is the same. What's different is the context. So it's the organizational context and the environment that differs. But actually, what we do, the methods, the tricks of the trade, if you like, are exactly the same. And that came as a little bit of a surprise for me, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm somewhat surprised about that, but yeah, you've spoken to the people. I guess often when people are talking about it, maybe they're thinking about this through a broader marketing lens, where you think about the decision-making process involving multiple decision makers versus a single decision maker. But even then, I think you can probably challenge some of those assumptions. But when it comes to comms, you're not coming at it quite from the same lens, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're all dealing with humans.
Yeah,
At the end of the day, the communications that we do is between human beings, and that's the same regardless of being B2B or B2C. It's just the context and the situations that differs. So if you drill down to it at that basic level, it's about humans. And then if you take it up a notch, obviously when you sit as the chief comms officers, you're looking at the organizational reputation as a whole, towards multiple stakeholders.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's again all human beings.
yeah, yeah. And when you look at it at that level, particularly at a large organizational level, maybe a listed company or a multinational company, there is way more overlap, isn't it? I can see why you say that now. And what any other surprises that you were challenged on, or you think, oh, I wasn't expecting that?
I think another surprise was, and again, the similarities between different organizations. So, and geographies as well. It didn't really matter if it's a large organization or a smaller organization, or um, where they were based. The similarities between the roles, I just think are fascinating and quite surprising. I spoke to some who just didn't have a team. It was a one person or two people kind of operations, and the others had hundreds of people in their teams.
Okay.
And the challenges were very similar. And that was quite surprising, I think, and in one way. And then in another way, it was also quite, well, yeah, that kind of also makes sense. Because it doesn't matter what size of organization, perhaps. Everyone comes up against the same challenges, especially with how the world and the macroeconomical climate is.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent most of my career agency side, so it's quite interesting to hear it from the other side of the fence, as it were. But one of the things that I think was true through all of that is that often if I was working with a PR or comms leader, they most of the time in the environments I was working in, they were either solo and very, very small teams, and it felt quite lonely actually. And I don't think it was about me, but often meeting their PR agency was the highlight of their week because it was somebody that understood what they were going through, that really was on the same side as them, that you could share jokes about experiences that you've had and stuff like that. And I think it's working in house at a senior level. I guess those things haven't really changed in recent years.
No, and I would agree and echo that. It came through several of the conversations that I had, is that it can feel slightly lonely in that sort of most senior comms role. Because also typically you're sitting on so much confidential information,
Yeah.
and you have to work with information across the organization in such a way. Obviously, you're working on announcements before they go out as well, so it can kind of feel like quite a lonely place to be. So I think finding a bit of a community and finding that peer support and peer network came through as a theme in some of the conversations as well. That it's really important that we have the support around us. so that both we can do a great job and also so that we can help other leaders excel and thrive.
That's very naturally segued into the advice piece, Tabita. So let's talk about that. Obviously you've covered it in the book, and you've got tons of experience yourself at a leadership level in this. So, what advice would you give to communications levels leaders or people that are coming through the ranks about how they can navigate all of this complexity that you've been talking about? What are some of the tips that you would offer to people?
So I think I've got two tips in particular. One is learn how to influence. Influencing skills is critical as you work through influence rather than control in most cases as a communications professional, especially if you're working in complex, large organizations, but also in smaller organizations. You're going to have to work across multiple stakeholders, both inside and outside an organization. So it's really important that you work on your influencing skills. And then I think the second part of advice is building trust. Trust is something that came through every single conversation I have, and how important it is to build trust with your stakeholders, build trust with your CEO, build trust with your executives and your senior leaders, and build trust with those stakeholders outside an organization. That is really important as well. That just helps on all levels. It helps cut time when you're in a crisis. It helps when you're trying to make a decision and you're providing advice around a particular situation or scenario. And it just really helps on all levels. So trust is the other one that I would say. Learn how to build trust and build good relationships within and outside an organization.
And how do you actually do that in practice? I mean, obviously, just demonstrating competence is one way, but it's more than that, surely. What are some of the things that someone can do to build trust?
So building relationships, learn how to build good relationships, which is a sort of a natural human skill, and doing so well in a business organization and an organizational scenario, I think is a practical way of doing it. Something else, just practically, is building stakeholder maps and kind of just mapping out who your stakeholders are, what's their perspective. So learning how to see others' perspectives. And thinking through all your different stakeholder groups and how they potentially could react and would react when around certain messages, and just building your skills in the communications planning side of things. So really thinking through things like what do we want someone to think, say, and do, and how can we improve our message around that, and just being critical around your own work to continue to improve. Some practical tips.
Sorry, I cut across you there for a moment. And are you getting a sense that people are getting plenty of training in these things? And if so, what kind of training are people getting? And I'm thinking in particular about communication skills and around how to get that message across and how to influence people. Is that something that people are getting through the ranks in the comms industry, or do you think it's lacking, or there's some areas for improvement?
I think it's a big area of improvement. I think the basic training that we get through university is pretty good these days. I see the sort of early graduates and juniors have some really great training. I think that's really improved over the last 10, 15 years. But then I think agencies and in-house comms teams then need to step up and take ownership of that, because from what I'm seeing, most people kind of tend to get thrown into the deep end and then having to learn that way. So I think there's absolutely a gap and an opportunity in providing training in that kind of middle years, if you like, of the craft, of the tips and tricks, of the skills, but also around strategy. I think that's probably the biggest opportunity, is just helping more comms professionals think around how they can provide strategic advice, not just tactical advice. Because I think in the beginning of our career, we get really good at writing a press release, we get really good at doing media relations, or we get really good at doing social media, for example. But helping our teams to kind of lift up and providing the strategic advice, that's where I see a bit of a gap and an opportunity in terms of training and learning.
One of the areas that I wish that I probably got a bit more training on and agency side really, but I think this probably applies in-house at all, is around financial knowledge and knowing how business works, profitability, how being able to read a P&L, some of these kind of things that I only got quite late. And by then I was already responsible for money and hiring and stuff, which is ludicrous, even in a small agency environment. But in a large company, do you get the sense that people are getting that kind of training or advice? Or is that something that needs more work?
That definitely needs more work. It actually came through most of the conversations in my book that one of the big steps, that if you take a step, say for example from VP to SVP or Chief Comms Officer, you often have to make the pivot to being a business leader, not just a communications leader. And a lot of comms people, I think, are very good at the craft. They're great at comms, but they haven't necessarily had the exposure to that business leadership side of things. So it's something, business and business acumen, as I call it, is something that we typically have to add. Now, that could be formal training, or it could be go and work in another department for a while. Doesn't necessarily have to go and work in finance or accounting, but just go and work perhaps in the business in another type of role to learn how things work, as it were. I think is absolutely crucial, especially if you're stepping up into that most senior level, because you sit around the boardroom and you hear the corporate finance jargon. It can actually sound like complete Japanese if you don't speak Japanese. It is a different language. So learning that before you take that step, it just helps with confidence and skills building too.
One of the big companies near where we live is Tesco. They've got their head office in Welwyn Garden City, and know a few people that work there, not in comms but in other leadership roles or senior roles, and they have to spend a certain amount of time in store, working in the store, particularly at busy times, but just so that they can actually feel. It's not a financial thing, but it's just being close to the customer, which I think is another aspect of kind of related to what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I saw through my conversation in the book 3 particular skills that are necessary for good comms leaders and good comms pros to develop. One is critical thinking, which we've already covered. The other one is courage, and the third one is curiosity. And curiosity really aligns with what you were just saying, Phil, because we need to be curious about our organizations so that we can learn as much as we can about them. It's really important to know and understand, how does an organization make money? It's the basics of what does our product do? How do we make money? How does it all hang together? And knowing the more that we can and being curious about that. And that could involve going and doing a secondment somewhere else in the organization to just learning more before then kind of coming back to comms to try and really supercharge your comms experience, if you like.
And I've got one more question I want to ask you. It's a little bit self-interested before we go on to the quickfire questions. And that's around how comms leaders regard the importance of developing their own personal brand. So obviously, you know, I work on helping people improve their presence on LinkedIn, but I get the sense. So we work with all kinds of organizations and individuals, but when we're working with comms leaders or people in the PR industry, there seems to be quite a reluctance and nervousness about putting themselves out there. And some of that might relate to what you were saying earlier about, well, the bastions of quite confidential information. There's only so much we can say. But I suppose it's two-part question. Do you see that too? Do you recognize that? And secondly, what can individuals do if they do want to do something for their personal brand to improve it?
Yes, I definitely see that too. And I think part of it is because we spend so much time advising organizations how to do it that I think we're probably a little bit tired when it comes to ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a little bit a case of we're so used to being behind the camera. Sometimes it's difficult to be in front of it. We've spent years advising media spokespeople on how to act and be in front of a camera, that we kind of got really used to and comfortable behind the camera. So I think that plays a part of it. Now, on the other hand, I also do think we have a responsibility, especially as a chief comms officer or working at the very top of our career, to actually step up and talk more about the role, because I think we need more role models in the industry. And I think the more that junior comms leaders and junior comms pros can look up at role models and see it's possible, this is what it takes to get there, the better it will be for everyone. So I do think we also have a responsibility to speak up and to build our own brands alongside. I think the way we do it is probably a little bit more trickier than perhaps some of the other functions. But it's absolutely there's a gap and an opportunity, I think, for a lot more chief comms officers to step up and do so. And I am starting to see that on LinkedIn in particular. I'm starting to see more chief comms leaders starting to build their brands and starting to post more, which I think is fantastic.
Well, outside of this, you'll have to tip me off on who some of those people are, because I'm always looking for case studies or examples of people that are doing it well. So let's move on to the. I have this written down on a piece of paper because I can never remember the quickfire questions. So we're going to just do a few of these before we wrap up. So starting with the piece around you being an author, and you've written a book for the comms industry. But who inspires you to write? Are there individuals or styles of writing or people that inspire you as a writer?
I'd like to mention two, if I may. One is a bit obvious, is J.K. Rowling, because I think her style of writing is just absolutely fantastic, and there's just so much you can learn as an author in terms of how the craft of writing. But then I also like to mention someone called Robin Sharma, who I've just recently got into, who does a lot of motivational speaking and motivational writing.
Okay.
And I just found his style of writing very interesting and very motivating. And it's something I'd like to kind of just dig into a little bit more. I haven't had a chance yet. But that's something that someone I just came across very recently.
Okay, I'm going to check that one out. That's a new one to me. And we always ask this question: a piece of marketing or business lingo that you would like to see banished. And there are a lot of choice in the comms industry, but what would you like to see go?
Oh, I can provide you with a long list, Phil.
Go on, give us your worst one.
The one that I particularly not enjoy is leverage.
Okay. Yeah.
All sorts of various reasons, but I never know whether to say leverage or leverage, having worked with local companies. And also, why not use gear instead of a lever or lever? So there's so much ways of using use or usage, and there's multiple other expressions that actually are much easier in a global setting, and are much more descriptive. I think it's such a jargon word.
You'd never use it in the house, would you?
No. Where do I have levers or levers? I don't.
Talking to your other half about, can we just leverage our opportunities for a better weekend? Okay, yeah. So do you have a random skill or fact about yourself that you've never told anybody else?
A random skill, I guess. I'm very good at growing things.
Okay.
I love growing vegetables, and I particularly enjoy trying new things every year. So last year I grew a round yellow cucumber, which I didn't even know existed. So growing unusual things is something I quite enjoy.
Good. Oh, we need to do more of that. We never grow enough. How's the dog situation going?
He's barking at the moment. You might hear him.
Okay. All right. Well, I've banished mine to the house because she. In fact, if she heard your dog now, that would be it. We'd be having a dog barking contest. And if you weren't working in the communications or marketing sector, what would you be doing instead?
So I would probably go back to my growing, my question around, the question about growing things. I would probably be working in a, say, garden nursery or somewhere where I could grow things, flowers, vegetables. I love being in nature and in the garden. So working somewhere where I can get my hands into soil and dirt.
That sounds a good one. I don't know about you, if what your local garden centre's like, but the people there always just seem like they're just the most chilled out people in the world. Go up there and get some plants. It's like, yeah, I think you've made some good life choices here about, at least in terms of not having stress. So that's a good one. Well, I feel like we're just about out of time, Tabita, but thank you so much for giving us all of your insights from your book and your career. I've learned a lot from talking to you, so thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure, Phil.
I have got one more question for you, though, which we always finish on. What is your motto in life?
So my motto is, the life in front of you is more important than the life behind you.
Oh, that's very well put. I love that. What a great way to finish. Thank you so much, Tabita. All that remains to say is let's play the music. Thank you.